And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm very excited today to be here with Abhay Kumar. He is the CEO of Helium Foundation. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. Helium is one of the longest running projects in Web3. Believe it or not, this is a project that dates back to 2013. I've been looking at the progress, following the progress of Helium for a very, very long time. There's been a lot of effort, a lot of code, a lot of people, time put into this project. And I'm very excited that Abhay is going to take us through the history, where they are today, the migration to Solana, a whole bunch of other things that are going on. Abhay, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you for having me, Anthony. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. Not at all. So for those who don't know, who have somehow managed to avoid Helium for the last 10 years, give us the origin story, give us the background. So tell us a little bit about the project and where you are today.
For sure. Yeah. So Helium started, as you mentioned, back in 2013, initially not as a blockchain project. It started off as an IoT project. The idea was to build a network for IoT devices and be able to sort of create a simple platform for folks to connect their sensors to their backends and be able to do some actions on it. It started off with a couple of different use cases. It's mostly around the sort of cold chain and supply chain monitoring side of things. The thing that the core team realized, and this is before I joined the project, the thing that the core team realized was, once you kind of leave the campus, the coverage is gone. And the end goal here was to have very, very simple to use, very cheap sensors that have a long battery life. And you didn't have to think about where to connect. Like when you and I go out in the world and we want to sort of connect to the internet, you might go to a coffee shop and ask for the Wi-Fi password. That is the fundamental thing that the Helium network solves, is that you don't have to go and ask for the Wi-Fi password everywhere you go, right? And this is much harder, obviously, when you're an IoT sensor, right? If you have a tracking application, for example, and it's traversing an entire country or going across the world, there isn't always guaranteed connectivity, and the sort of mode of connectivity might change over time. And that's ultimately what the core team realized really in 2018, is that there needed to be another way to deploy coverage, and incentivizing deploying coverage is I think the sort of primary innovation of the Helium network. How do you ensure that there is coverage before there's usage, and once there is usage, how do you continue to reward that coverage being provided? So fast track to 2018. They started working on this new sort of concept of applying this network on a blockchain. 2019 was when the chain launched and when the network launched. And around the time when I actually started working on the project, I started off as a hotspot owner. I bought some hotspots, and then I found this thing to be really interesting. The last crypto project before, arguably, that I worked on was really Bitcoin. I started experimenting with it fairly early on, and didn't really see this level of utility until Helium. And for me, that's what attracted me to the network. I love the fact that I could provide internet connectivity to devices and people in a decentralized way. I sort of believe fundamentally in this ability for communities to sort of build themselves up and sort of provide and help each other. And I think Helium is sort of a great example of how this is come to be.
Love that. Straight out of the blocks, and a very, very simple but very, very clear understanding, right? That IoT devices are not able to check into Starbucks periodically across their journey from wherever it is they're going from and to. That we have a sporadic network of coverage of bandwidth that can be made available. We have an abundance of bandwidth, actually. And so that's something that people should be able to share, should be able to offer to others, and there should be an incentive and a reward mechanism behind it. And I guess that was how do we do the reward mechanism in as automated a way as possible, right? Was that what the kind of the blockchain moment was? Oh, I think that's the software that allows this to happen.
That's exactly right. I think there aren't a lot of systems that are permissionless and censorship resistance, and these are the kinds of tools that we've created in our ecosystem at large. And we continue to innovate on. I think certainly blockchain technologies are not done being built by any means, and I think that as we see this network grow, we hope to be a part of that sort of iteration as well.
Very good. A quick reminder to those listening in, give us your GMs, let us know where you're coming in from. This is live on LinkedIn. So anybody who has a question for Abhay, anybody who wants to know more about Helium Network, about the process they've been going through, about the migration to Solana, that's coming up. Anybody who has any interest, please do spam the comments now. I'll do my best to multitask and find some of the juiciest, most interesting comments, and we can cover those at the end of the show. We're always interested in knowing where you're coming from. There's already some existing Helium node runners coming into the chat as well, so that's really good news. So great to see the Helium fam out there as well. So please do questions in the comments, and I'll try and get to as many of those with Abhay by the end of the show. Let's talk about blockchain and IoT. So I think oftentimes people think about technologies in isolation because oftentimes it's hard, it's complex. You say, okay, well, I'm just going to go monoline blockchain and I'm going to talk as much about blockchain as I possibly can, or I'm going to go really deep on cloud, or my new focus is going to be artificial intelligence, and that's the only thing that I'm going to think about and talk about. Whereas the reality of it is that any application, any system usually combines a multitude of different technologies together to make things happen. That's how computers and software work. What do you find particularly compelling, or when people ask you about blockchain and IoT together, what are the examples or the benefits that you give?
Yeah, I think you pointed out something interesting, which is you sort of you have to put different technologies together to build a product, and ultimately that is what matters. Like no one really cares. Let's be entirely honest. As much as I love the technology, no one really cares about the IoT side or the blockchain side or the AI side or the cloud side or anything. They ultimately care about what can you do with it, right? Like that is maybe the most important thing, and certainly is the most important thing for me. What is the product here? The product here is a sensor that ultimately provides data, and that data is actionable, right? That is the end goal here. In sort of the new parts of the Helium network, a phone is able to connect to a node that is running and providing internet access for that phone, and providing a data backhaul for that phone. These are real practical applications, and ultimately it's about connecting devices and people, and doing something with those things, right? And so for me, like, why does blockchain matter here is that it's sort of the fundamental properties of chains that allow this kind of network to flourish in such a short period of time. Building an infrastructure network over the last 3 years, and this to the size that we've gotten to, over 490,000 active nodes that are actively providing IoT coverage all over the world. I don't think that's possible with traditional capital allocation models, and I don't think that's possible, and certainly sort of in the traditional telecom model. And that's the sort of unlock that I think that we've been sort of a benefit of, and our community as a whole has been able to start using this product. And I would say, like, it's taken time to get to a state where I would say the network is stable enough for it to be used. 6, maybe 8 months ago is probably when I would say that, if I was building a product, I would start building, right? If I was purely on the sort of sensor side, or building a tracking device, or building a smart agriculture sort of sensor, I would start building about then, because that's when I know that this network is really there, and ubiquitous, and affordable, right? And that's ultimately what I think end users really care about, is like, can I use this network? Is it fairly inexpensive? And is a technical lift to start using this network reasonable for my business?
Got you. And I think there's 2 important points there. Is probably coverage and competition that I want to go into in a little bit more detail, because half a million nodes that's quite a lot of nodes. And there's not that many other blockchains or layer 1s and layer 2s that can say we've got 500,000 nodes. So that's a positive story from the get-go. But in terms of coverage, obviously this is intended to be a global proposition. What do you consider to be minimum viable when it comes to coverage? Do you think about geographies? Do you think about locations? Do you think about time of day? What are some of the things that go into building a network like that?
I think it comes down to applications, and this is maybe one of the hard parts of the Helium network, which is that I think that if you're thinking about a tracking application, one that requires wide coverage across lots of geography, across many different kinds of topological features, like I live in the Bay Area, we have lots of hills here, and so people need to know that there's sufficient coverage in a city like San Francisco, or in a city like Pittsburgh is another city in the U.S. that has a lot of hills. You need to make sure that the radios ultimately like still have to follow the rules of physics. It can't go through hills, and can't go through mountains, and it hates water. There's lots of things that radios are pretty finicky about, and so ultimately, great coverage is really about ensuring that. And the way that we sort of figure this out is we sort of ensure that the nodes themselves can kind of talk to each other, and those are sort of proxies of whether or not a sensor could talk to one of these nodes. And we try to sort of align this sort of proof of coverage system with the actual incentivization, so that later on when a sensor comes by, it knows that there is actual coverage there as well.
Got you. Very good. And the second C that I wanted to ask about was competition, because I think you've got a number of different ways that devices can connect to the internet today. You've got broadband, you've got Wi-Fi, you've got various different propositions and products from eccentric technology billionaires out there that are sending Wi-Fi from space. And at some point, these will overlap. They'll be competing. In some cases, they may even be ubiquitous. How do you think about competing with those sorts of services, and where does Helium win?
I think Helium wins with low power, long range communications. So and also low bandwidth. So we are not going to win on the video streaming side, at least not on the Helium IoT network, because it's just not not meant for that purpose. But certainly if you have a single sensor on every single row of crop in your farm, and you have a single node or maybe two nodes across several acres, will win for sure, right? It doesn't make sense for you to run a Starlink terminal for every single line of crop, and it certainly doesn't make sense for. And by the way, I love Starlink. I think it's I could tell you a lot about sort of my opinions on broadband access. I think ultimately every single human on this earth needs broadband access, and I think Starlink is a way to get there. But I don't think every single line of sort of plant needs access at that level, and I think that's where I think we win certainly on the smart agriculture side. And on the other side, if you think about things like tracking, the tracking use case, it's really about having a very, very inexpensive sticker or an inexpensive sensor that you could attach to a box. And we already see this. There's a great company in our ecosystem called TrackPack, homegrown. Like the founder is actually a Helium hotspot owner who was just very excited about the technology and built this application, is working with partners and working with a company called NanoThings to attach a sticker on the side of a box, and this sticker is providing probably better sort of location information about where your box is than UPS or FedEx can, which I think is really, really powerful, especially for high value box sort of products.
Nice. I was about to start going into applications. So while we're there, let's talk about them, because I think you started talking about crops. You started talking about logistics to some extent, where you don't want expensive connections, or you don't want expensive subscriptions to always on internet, because you don't necessarily need always on internet from one provider, or where you can provide cheaper connections that will be within your route coverage. You can provide that at a lower fee. So I think those are super interesting. And like you said, your coverage pattern, or how you would like to scale the coverage of Helium, is a little bit dependent on what the ecosystem would like to use Helium for, which is that kind of constant chicken and egg challenge with every layer one protocol is exactly the same. Is what use case are we good for? Well, what use case would you like to build? Do we need to optimize for what you're building? Well, we're going to provide something that is universal, a blockchain, build on it as you wish, create smart contracts, connect oracles, whatever you want to do. It works for everything. Decentralize whatever you like, go get it. It's like, well, that's not really very helpful for me. Help, bring it to life a little bit. What are the? I know you're not allowed to have favorites, but what are the kind of 2 or 3 applications that you regularly point to say these guys fit the model, or we'd love to see more of this?
I mean, I think ultimately, obviously, I love the things that we build in our ecosystem, and I love the companies that build the things on top of our ecosystem. I think, two really, really interesting sort of products that are also blockchain applications that I love to talk about is, a company like HiveMapper and a team like a product like HiveMapper. HiveMapper uses the Helium network to verify the locations of all of the sort of reported maps and sort of mapping events that are happening on their network, and they use Helium hotspots to sort of verify that it's that it's where it says it is. Because I think location matters very much for them. And so if you have, let's say, a single dash cam that goes down a street, and that that dash cam sees 4 hotspots along that same street. Then let's say another dash cam goes by that same street and it sees those 4 hotspots again, or maybe those 4 plus a few others. There's sort of additional verification that that second one saw the same thing as the first one. It's probably in the same location as the first one. So over time, you kind of build the sort of trust model around it. And then let's say you see a dash cam that goes down that same street that doesn't actually see those hotspots, then you sort of question it. You're not sure. So it's certainly worth review to try to understand if there's change. So that's I think a really great application that uses Helium for location verification. Other projects out there are experimenting with Helium for just purely backhaul, right? You're able to calculate weather data and capture that and then transfer that over the Helium network for backhaul. You're able to capture energy information, maybe battery status or sort of power within devices within your house, and you're able to backhaul that over the Helium network. The advantage of something like this is that any sort of smart home appliance for that latter use case, you have typically what do? We sort of open this thing up, you scan this QR code, you connect it to a Wi-Fi network. Hopefully you have Wi-Fi in the place where you have this device. An energy monitoring solution is probably attached to your power panel, which is nowhere near your Wi-Fi router. But with a technology like LoRaWAN, the IoT protocol that we use for Helium, it's a lot easier to provide coverage for devices that are very, very far away from internet sources. And so those are, I think, 2 really, really great use cases that I love and would love to see more of. I think there's a tremendous sort of opportunity for folks to build more things on this network. There's quite a bit of coverage that's available. So I think we are sort of ready to see these kinds of devices, and we're happy to work with folks in the ecosystem to help them bring them to life.
Love that. And do you see a challenge with, as I said, you're not just trying to scale a Helium network, you're obviously trying to scale or you're interested in the scaling of the IoT networks as well. And I was having a conversation earlier today with some colleagues around how do we expect the future to unfold. So specifically talking about Midnight, which is the project that I'm involved in, which focuses on data protection and zero knowledge proofs. And there are a number of different drivers, particularly around that sort of technology. People and enterprises interested in data protection, in IP protection, the scaling of fully autonomous and decentralized applications for enterprise and for individuals. Right? Anywhere where a blockchain application can exist, our technology can sit underneath it and provide some of the data protection capability. For you, I promise that wasn't a deliberate plug, but I'm giving an example in context. For you, the usage of those devices and then the application of those devices and the sales of the applications of those devices that can then plug into the Helium network are sort of some of the rate limiting or the required enablement for you guys to scale as well. How do you make that work? How do you grow an ecosystem like Helium where you've got that significant reliance on other infrastructure as well as your own?
That's a good question. I mean, I think ultimately the simple one-liner that I would say is patience. I think coming from the hardware side, patience is something that you kind of learn. It takes quite a bit to sort of even think about building a piece of hardware, and then on top of that is to actually execute it. It's actually even harder. And I think that ultimately some of the things that people hope for in the sort of crypto ecosystem as a whole is something very, very fast. Which I think that there's a lot of value in fast. There's a lot of value in iteration. That's very, very quick. But there, with a ecosystem like Helium, which is a physical infrastructure network, and it's really around building hardware applications. Some of these hardware supply chains take time and get affected by massive black swan events like a global pandemic, and I think there's just a lot of there are a lot of reasons why things take time in hardware. Some of them practical, and some of them just incredibly frustrating, right? And sort of that's sort of where I have come with patience. Is something that I said that 6 months ago it was sort of when I would have started building a real application on top of the Helium network, 6 to 8 months ago. And I should probably change that because that's sort of a benchmark that I used to have, that changes every day. But I think what that means is that I started designing a piece of hardware at that point, and designing ultimately an application that needed a piece of hardware, and tried to bring it to market. And that could take almost a year sometimes. I think there's some really, really great rapid prototyping sort of opportunities now in hardware, and there are new companies that are helping making it very, very easy or easier to build a piece of hardware, build a dev board, or using sort of developer toolkits to do this. But it still takes some amount of time to do that. And I think that's ultimately what I would say, um, uh, I hope to bring to the our ecosystem is some amount of patience.
Yeah, I think with everything, where there is a physical transformation involved, or where there's a physical product involved, or physical connection involved, there's just more complexity. We take for granted that a lot of the early stage use cases around Web3 were natively digital assets. They were already currencies. They were already art. They were already digital records that didn't have to have anything physically attached to them, or there wasn't a requirement to identify or create a digital twin of those because they were already digital. And the use cases that focus around phygital or consumer goods or logistics, they're feasible. The technology is ready, is performant today for what's required for the use cases that we're looking to deliver. It's just the physical tagging, connecting, charging up, validating, assurance, if you want to go there, right? I can put an IoT tag on a Lamborghini if I want to and say, hey guys, you own one thousandth of a Lamborghini. It's like, that's great. Is it rusty? Are the wheels still on it? Has the engine been serviced? Do the seats still exist? Has it been cleaned? Certain things that relate to then obviously the resulting value of that individual item is not something a blockchain could ever tell you. It can just tell you that something checked in. You are the owner of it. There have been certain attestations over a period of time, a transaction log, a historical record, but the physical side of actually, what's there, you've got other transformations. So maybe you need to have attestations from a bonded warehouse. Maybe you need to have a live camera pointing at the Lamborghini at all times so you can check in where it is. I don't know, right? I'm not the expert. This is probably not the best use case for things, but I guess it demonstrates some of the challenges with physical infrastructure as well, and that you guys have got to nearly, that volume of nodes, nearly 500,000 nodes, is phenomenal, because physical progress is hard. We did want to talk about the migration. So, you said about 2018, you guys said, right, we need this to be decentralized. We need to have a reward system. We need to have a way of keeping track, a way of managing with these devices that is autonomous, that is low cost, that is always on, that is transparent. There is technology for that. Did you start with your own chain? Were you kind of building your own blockchain app, blockchain from scratch, and then there was a realization that, actually that's a lot of hard work as well as doing the other stuff? How did the conversation go?
Sure. So, when this all started, we did start with our own chain. We actually launched it in 2019, and it was, it was all built in house. It was written in a language called Golang, which was sort of the team had a lot of expertise in. We had some phenomenal engineers on the core team that were able to build on that. I think it's a great language for building highly available systems. I've had some experience building on it as well in the past. So I think ultimately, like, that was at the time it made sense to launch our own chain, mostly because at the time, everything was considered. Like, can we put a Bitcoin miner on every single hotspot? That doesn't make sense from a power perspective. Is Ethereum, going to have, then that time all we had was ETH1. Was that sufficient, and would that scale to the needs of this kind of network where we had rewards being issued every 30 minutes to every single hotspot? Did it have where we could onboard sensors, we could have state channels that managed all the sensor traffic? Did that make sense at the time from a cost perspective? It didn't. We didn't see it working for us at the time, and obviously this is before sort of the modern age of Ethereum, but I think our hypothesis was probably correct there. And so we started building a chain, and yes, we built both a wireless network and a blockchain at the same time. That is two enormous tasks. About now about a year and a half ago, we started thinking about, and actually, let me go back a little further. At the time when we started, every single Helium hotspot was a full node on the blockchain. So there was a time that we had hundreds of, over 100,000 full nodes, all speaking to each other over God knows what internet connection. So we had to deal with all sorts of liquidity issues, breaking through firewalls and breaking through NAT and every sort of thing that you could imagine doing for this enormous decentralized network. And one of the first steps we actually took was to move to a proof of stake model using our own chain and moving these sort of full nodes to sort of server hardware, like cloud or physical hardware that was dedicated for the purpose of chain validation and transaction validation and block production, right? So those are the that's kind of the first step that we took, but we did have that thought back then that is this going to continue to scale for us, or should we consider something else? This network was built very, 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 very quickly, far surpassing anyone's expectations, I think, at least, certainly on the technical team. And so we, about a year and a half ago, we started floating around this idea of running our network, our protocol, on another chain. And the first hint of this was in a HIP called HIP 51, where we started talking about what did we need going forward, and one of the things that we thought about that we needed going forward was being able to support multiple networks, not just the IoT network, but also to bring in a 5G cellular network, or a Wi-Fi network, or potentially a VPN network, or other kinds of data networks that sort of fit within the Helium model. That sort of kicked off this conversation about, if not, what could we do with our existing chain? That was the first conversation, of course. And then if not, what could we do with other chains? And we started going through an evaluation. Last summer, we sort of proposed this idea of, yes, we should move to another chain, and it should be Solana. And typically in our ecosystem, governance comes from highly sort of opinionated proposals that are vetted open in the community, and then voted on. I think that we have a fairly relative to a lot of other governance and DAOs that are out there, we have a very, very active community, and we have 180,000 people on our Discord servers. We have thousands of wallets voting for proposals. We have actually two right now, soon to be 3 active proposals later today. And we're constantly sort of testing ideas and asking questions in the community, and then you have members of the community sort of asking each other effectively. And then that is, I think, one of the highlights of our network. And so last year, this proposal around the Solana migration came up really as a consequence of moving a lot of the sort of data processing of the network to oracles. And that it was really, like, from my perspective, it was really we've taken all this kind of processing, or we're proposing we move all this stuff into oracles. Therefore, we should think about moving the chain, right? Because the chain doesn't really need to do much anymore, except for like transaction validation, block production. And should we really, really be spending a lot of our time on very, very important primitives for blockchains, when we really could be spending that time on the important primitives for wireless networks? And that's ultimately why a chain migration made sense.
That's a really important point at the end there, in terms of, and every team, layer 1, layer 2 startup DApp builder has a limited amount of dev capacity relative to its budget. And a team that's been going for 10 years obviously has still been doing relatively well. But when you have to maintain a wireless network, version upgrades, innovation and partnerships, and also a chain at the same time, that's a lot. Right? Just managing a chain by itself. Interesting to hear that it went through decentralized governance. I think that's super. I wonder, whether there were other proposals. Did everybody come up with saying, we should put this on Dogecoin, we should put this on Tron, we should put this on BitConnect? How was there a short list of chains along with Solana, or was that literally the one that just captured everyone's imagination?
So I wrote a blog post about this, actually, and sort of had a big matrix, and happy to drop a link to you later that you can share with your community. And it was sort of a big matrix of different chains that we considered, and it was everything from the kinds of things that we thought about was everything from key compatibility. So we use the Edwards curve, which is not the standard key curve that's used for Ethereum for all of our wallets. And one of the things that we've thought about all along was user experience. Onboarding. So when we did the migration, just to give you a sense of scale, there's over 700,000 wallets migrated, and so being able to move that many wallets, and of course there's plenty of people that have multiple wallets, right? I'm not saying that 700,000 users. That's a foolish statement. Still it's a significant. I doubt that a single person has 100,000 wallets. Let's put it that way. And so I think that moving that many wallets is a huge task, and one of the biggest risks that we thought about was if we do it through a bridge or if we do it through some kind of redemption flow, the chance of that bridge or that redemption flow being compromised is actually pretty high, and that wasn't a risk that I thought. That was a risk that I thought that we should measure, and then we should decide whether or not we want to take on. The other, risk is like, heliummigration.com gets created and someone decides to rug a bunch of tokens from somebody, and that's also a risk that I think happens when you sort of have kind of a very centralized migration path. And so, I think that for us, that was a thing that we considered. We considered the dev ecosystems of all the different things that are out there. We also considered running our own, whether or not we would have to continue running our own L1 or at least an app chain. Certainly, like, really great projects out there have looked at DYDX has looked at Cosmos as an SDK, and we definitely looked at it as well. It'd be foolish of us not to. Had really great conversations with core contributors in the Cosmos ecosystem. Had really great conversations with folks in other ecosystems, and ultimately, we thought about dev ecosystem, we thought about key compatibility, we thought about speed and cost. Obviously, like, that's a really important thing for us. And ultimately we landed on Solana. There were a few other pseudo proposals, folks that plenty of people met on the internet, certainly, but none of them who really sort of came with a credible, I would say, argument that was worth bringing to a vote at the time. In retrospect, would I have had like a bake-off kind of thing? Probably not. Doing that in the decentralized governance, that basically tells a sort of developer team, here's what you're going to build, rather than saying, here's a new idea and here's a dev team that would build it. Would have been a really, really credible argument, I would say, and we didn't see a whole lot of those, at least not last year. Yeah, so that's like roughly how we got to it, and then we started building.
Awesome. We'll get into the building in a bit, but I'm really curious for those people who haven't been in through that process, and having worked for layer ones and been involved in some of the kind of growth partnerships type of conversations, I know a little bit of how these things go. But from your side, what does a beauty contest look like when you've got protocols fighting over your application? Because Helium is a fantastic name, right? It's a long brand, established project, existing ecosystem, 700,000 wallets, whether those be individuals or not. Those are big numbers for anybody. And there's going to be chains out there who are really going to want to fight for that, or who are really interested in that kind of business. Tell us a little bit, without obviously disclosing any secrets or confidential stuff, what does a beauty contest look like for chains coming to you and saying, hey, this is what we can offer, or this is why you should stick with us? What are some of the things that you experience in that process for people who haven't been through it?
I mean, we didn't really run a beauty contest, to be honest. I think they're kind of gross, to be honest. Like, I think ultimately, like, we made a technical decision, and we really made a technical proposal based on knowledge that we had, and I think our community trusts us to execute on it. Like, I think that's really what it was. I think that if I don't know, like, I think ultimately, like, if there was a dev team that was willing to build, and was able to execute the way that we did. The migration happened, basically as a single day in April. You opened your wallet, you saw a little spinner, and a few hours later, it loaded up exactly as you saw before, and all the tokens that you had were already there. Right? That's the magical user experience that ultimately helps users. Like that's the most important thing to me.
That's a seamless experience. And in that migration, then tell us a little bit about how it actually happens, and from the build side, and then I guess from the user side. So, there was a Helium token. Is it now sold? Is there still a Helium token? Was there engagement with exchanges? Was there engagement with refactoring some of the code? Talk us through some of the highlights or lowlights of that experience for you guys.
For sure, yeah. So there was a Helium token on Sovereign L1. That Helium token became in the Solana ecosystem, they're called SPL tokens, Solana Program Locker tokens, and so it became a standard SPL token in the Solana ecosystem. SPL tokens are similar to ERC20s and sort of other similar token standards that exist on other chains. And so, for the end user, it was a entry in one database that moved to an entry in another database. Like that's really what the end user, and it's the same entry, right? So, the way that we did the token, the sort of chain migration and the state migration, it's not just the tokens that moved over, was we halted the Helium L1, took a snapshot of all of the state that existed in the Helium L1, loaded into a specific kind of program, a migration program on Solana, and that it was a sort of permissionless migration that any wallet user could essentially just like a pinata. You hit the pinata and you get, and as long as you have the exact same key, your wallet on the Solana side just have all the tokens, and that's it. And you just keep doing what you were doing before. And that's sort of the user experience we were hoping for, and we were able to achieve, which is essentially you sort of tap the pinata and you get it. And that's the same. And the other thing that we wanted to do there is that sort of action of tapping the pinata was also the action that you have to take every time you want to claim your rewards for IoT coverage or cellular coverage. On a daily basis, your hotspot accrues rewards, and then whenever you want to, and this is now entirely your choice, you have to force tokens, so you can make decisions on that if you want to defer or if you want to get it every day or whatever. You can sort of tap the pinata yourself, or you can delegate the right to tap the pinata if you use some protocols that are out there. That's the other thing that I think has been really interesting is that in the last several months, you see other folks in the Solana ecosystem building on top of Helium protocols and on top of Helium products, and enabling Helium users to use other things in the Solana ecosystem. And I think that's one of the other advantages of a wider ecosystem. We didn't have a smart contract framework on the Helium L1, and to build that would have taken a lot of focus away from building the wireless network again. Like that's you hear that theme over and over again from me, which is like ultimately we want to enable a lot of other folks to build adjacent products for this Helium ecosystem. That's it. That's roughly what it looked like. It's a very simple, tap the thing and you're now migrated. What happened in the back end there was a lot of software that needed to be written. The smart contracts had to be written. The economics had to be rewritten for the Solana chain. All of that needed to be secure audited. We had a wonderful audit company that we worked with that we were able to publish our clean audit for the migration, and we continue to use them as we make upgrades to the network as the community continues to sort of drive change in the network.
Nice. I mean, it's great that you were able to make the user experience that seamless. I'm sure the engineering effort was not insignificant, and congrats to you guys for getting there. Really interesting point around the ecosystem, right? Being able to now access, or being able to have other parties on the Solana ecosystem natively access or engage with Helium, whether it be Helium tokens, whether it be the Helium network, create dApps that talk to Helium or that are designed for Helium. Essentially, you've just kind of gained a whole bunch of new builders that are excited or maybe potentially interested to work with you, because the more applications that are built on that native network, on Solana or whichever ecosystem it's built in, that ecosystem grows, more value is attracted to it, better stories, better attention, and anyone who has a stake in that network, their stake will benefit. I didn't want to say to be as blunt as token go up, but if you think about it in shared incentives and stakeholder terms, that's kind of how ecosystems and open platforms grow. And so from your perspective, you gained a whole bunch of new builders, people who are interested, who can get very excited about a new project in the network, people who may have been interested to build on an IoT related infrastructure, maybe didn't have one before, now they do. Super interesting. I do have one question though. Is it an actual pinata that they have to tap? And if it is, why?
It's not an actual pinata. But it is a smart contract that lives on the Solana blockchain that understands every single hotspot of the ecosystem, what rewards they need to be issued, and with your signature, it's able to you're able to tap pinata. But it's just tap the smart contract, I guess.
There we go. Not an actual pinata. For those who are listening in who may have been confused as to how we decentralize pinatas, don't worry. It was an analogy for a smart contract, but it's a good one. And again, if you've got to tap something, it could be a button, it could be a pinata, it could be an orange, it could be whatever you like. So thank you for clarifying. You've been through a lot as a project, clearly. The establishment of physical infrastructure, a chain migration, growing an ecosystem to a scale of 500,000 nodes, 700,000 wallets. That's a lot in 10 years in total, but I suspect the 2018 until now is actually a very condensed period of where a lot of the intense activity has gone. What would be your guidance for other people building with decentralized technology at this point in time? We've been through a lot in Web3 in the last 12 months. We've been through a lot in Web3 in general, but at this point in our history, or at this point in time, what would be some of the important guidance you would give to other people listening in?
I mean, I think the first thing is build something that is actually useful for users, right? Like, I think that we have a lot of there's a lot of excitement in our ecosystem, and driven by like quite a few like sort of bear and bull market cycles, and then like you sort of see others coming in and out of the ecosystem when this happens, and ultimately, like, I think if you focus on building an application that someone actually cares about and sort of appropriately incentivize the holders and the folks that have stake in that network, I think ultimately you'll build something valuable and that's long lasting. And I think I think about the Helium Network as something that I'm building that's like 50, 100-year lifespan, right? Like I'm not really thinking about building this for the next couple of years or anything like that. Like that's ultimately, like, utility drives interest and will drive more builders into the ecosystem, and I think the rest of it, like the token price you said earlier, like that takes this is like the sort of classic score takes care of itself mantra, and I think that is a lagging indicator in my opinion. The leading indicator is, are you providing something useful for users?
Really great way of thinking about it. And again, the point here is we're building applications. The infrastructure is different. The Helium infrastructure has a particular novel feature that it connects to IoT, or it's a protocol that's designed to work with IoT, as opposed to trying to hard code smart contracts to Ethereum. That's not something you would necessarily want to do natively yourself. And also, we're creating standards. We're creating a platform that others can build on. You've identified that with the migration. Now you're able to connect into another ecosystem of builders whose applications can now start talking to IoT networks, which can add another layer of innovation. Ultimately, what we're trying to do with all of this is to democratize access to technology to be able to make things go better, faster, reduce risk, reduce cost. Whatever it is you're trying to improve with technology, we're providing infrastructure and applications that do that. And the easier it is, the more connected it is, the more standardized it is, generally speaking, the better things will flow. But if you're building an application that people won't use, or that people won't be happy to pay for, your commercial model will struggle before you've even talked about what chain you're going to build it on, or what grants you're going to be able to receive to build it. And I think that's not even a Web3 problem. That's an every application ever problem.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Like, this is, when I think about the chain migration, someone once asked me, like, what did you think about it? I said, it's like moving from AWS to Azure, or Azure to AWS, or really like my own private cloud, I guess, in a way. to a public cloud. That's the underlying technology, although really, really cool, by the way. And I actually hope that someone uses our old blockchain for something useful, because we spent a ton of time on it. There's a ton of research into it, and I think there's some really, really good bits in there that I think could be reapplied somewhere else. And I hope to reapply them actually, as we continue to iterate on some of the smart contracts that we're working on. And I think, but those underlying ideas, they don't matter as much as the product, right? Like, then the product is really the sort of thing that I think ultimately what people care about. And like that, we need to get to there. We certainly need to get to the end faster in that way. To sort of counter my patient's comment from earlier.
nice balance on that one. And yeah, the token is not the product, unless it's Bitcoin, in which case the token is the product. But for pretty much everything else, the token's not the product. And so focus on applications, user value, enterprise value, critically important. I do have one more question before we go to the Q&A, which is probably not something you'll even consider in the next 12 or even 24 months, but would you consider another chain migration in future, and under what conditions?
That's a tough question. I think ultimately it is entirely up to our community, is maybe the first answer to that. And ultimately, if our community feels that our current home is not serving the purposes of our network and enabling us to build this decentralized wireless network of networks, really at this point, multiple networks, then yeah, it is absolutely on the table. The things that we built, sure, it would be a technical lift to make a change, but I think ultimately, like, whatever's next has to have all the sort of qualities that we already have. Like, we shouldn't be regressing in any way. And I think that is really, really important to sort of figure out how to sort of not regress if we were ever to consider a change like that. I think it would be, a catastrophic event that would force us to do so. We certainly need for Solana and continue to run Solana nodes. The sort of software is pretty damn good, and not biased, and somewhat biased, I guess, so not entirely biased. But I think certainly you could fork if we wanted to, and on our own state. If we wanted to, we would unfortunately go back into the mode of running our own chain again. That is a pain. And I'd be back on carrying a pager again for block production. But it's a choice, right? And I think ultimately, back to my initial point, it's sort of a community choice, but it has to be credible. It has to be really, really well thought out, and it has to have a sort of developer backing that will get us there as well. And I would certainly I would consider if we were in dire straits for whatever reason.
That's a really good answer. And I promise I wasn't trying to make your life difficult or to in any way fudge your choice of Solana. That was absolutely not my point. It was actually when you made the reference or the analogy to transferring from one cloud provider to another, from going from on-prem to cloud, or from private cloud to public cloud. I wrote a blog article in 2017 about that exact topic, about saying theoretically with EVM or EVM compliant chains, you can see applications moving chains relatively easily. Now, if it's EVM Avalanche, EVM Ethereum, EVM something else, EVM Solana, EVM Polkadot, there are some characteristics of the technology that sit underneath there that you may choose to move for. But with blockchains and ecosystems, you actually get increasingly embedded, and the lock-in factor with blockchains and Web3 ecosystems, I think, is significantly stronger than with cloud. The cloud, for the most part, is a commodity. Yes, you might get some discounts for some of the other features and functionality, but I'm pretty sure most of the cloud providers at this point are offering a very, very similar service, very, very similar pricing, with variations on incentives from month to month, depending on how the businesses are performing. That is a very different story than one you've described, which talks about application builders, which talks about token migration, which talks about managing or not managing, or forking or not forking. There's quite a lot of technical lock-in that's created there. It is feasible to fork, but it's not just the technology I think you make the decision for. Catastrophic event would be one thing for sure. would you necessarily get a more willing or more excited or more agitated developer community if you move to a different chain tomorrow? That's not a guarantee. And you'll probably find out in the next few months how engaged the Solana ecosystem is to work with Helium, how many innovative ideas come because of that. You can't predict those collisions, right? The great applications that get built on Helium in the next 6-12 months are probably nothing you forecasted, or it will come completely randomly from the Solana ecosystem just because you happen to be right place, right time, or right chain, right community. So I'm kind of wheeling back on what I wrote all those years ago, because actually I think the lock-in factors are somewhat more complex than just this chain goes faster, the coding language is better, the latency is less, they have a zero knowledge capability that we're really excited by, or whatever else, because I think it's harder. Thank you for going align on me with that one, because I that's not something we've ever discussed actually on the show before. And using you guys as an example, as a reference, I think is I think hopefully powerful and interesting for the listeners at the same time.
I think just to add to that, the sort of serendipitous usage and sort of integration with the Helium ecosystem. Literally 2 days ago, someone in a lending protocol DAO proposed that they to allow Agent 2 to be added to this lending protocol. It was total surprise, and 2 days later it was approved. And I didn't dive in deep on the sort of governance of the protocol, so I can't say if 2 days is fast or slow, but that seems insanely fast to me. And then that kind of serendipitous activity that's happening in the Solana ecosystem is pretty incredible. And then the other thing that you mentioned, some of the features of different chains that are out there really do matter for certain applications. Solana has incredibly fast, incredibly cheap transactions, and this concept of local fee markets that allow some parts of the state to be able to charge less than other parts of the state. And that's actually really important, and that sort of enables scalability of when you have this sort of monolithic, and the monolith modular argument. I feel like I just probably opened a can of worms by even saying that word. So I apologize already. But this sort of, when you have a single state machine, that is you need ways to sort of have kind of hotspot mitigation within the state, and I think Solana is sort of really focused on building this kind of sort of going this way, rather than thinking about sharding or thinking about layers or things like that. And I think there's some advantages that you get there around composability, but some disadvantages, right? Like you have to also build very very powerful validators in order to sort of and that's a trade-off. And I think a intellectually honest argument around those trade-offs is possible if you're sort of willing to sort of accept those as that argument that there are trade-offs. And it's okay to also just be certain, right? Like this is the disagree and commit sort of approach as well. Right? It's okay to have both.
I think we need more intellectually honest discussions in this ecosystem. And thank you for having a very intellectually honest discussion with us, and for sharing what I think is very, very unique experience. I think there are very few projects and chains that have gone through the experience that you guys have. There's a couple of questions here. We've got a couple of minutes left. So if I can ask, the first one here is from Wayne, who says, what's the role that governments may have on Helium's growth? So they're talking specifically, or he's alluding specifically to infrastructure or to wider network capability within different countries. Is that something that you look at when you're focusing on growth?
So it's actually one of our jobs on the Helium Foundation to spend our time on. We spend our time with governments, we spend our time with regulatory bodies. Really trying to educate, like that's number one. Number two, help guide future discussions and future regulation, and hopefully expand this network into every single government, every single sort of region that's out there. Ultimately, that what is like, and I think the rest of that question is like people are fighting the idea of 5G. There's a lot of different versions of what 5G is, and I think the wireless industry hasn't done itself any favors by sort of changing that definition over and over again. And apparently there's 6, 7, 10G already, so who knows? Yeah, exactly. Same. I think like ultimately, like 5G, the sort of initial promise of 5G was high bandwidth, low latency connectivity, right? I want to be able to, stream my football game when at the park, or I want to be able to, TikTok stream the fact that I'm like at the baseball game or something like that, right? Like that. Those are the kinds of things that that people care about, or people are starting to care about more. High bandwidth, low latency connectivity for cellular devices typically, but maybe other kinds of devices as well. And I think that's an important argument for 5G, but like really, like governments, at least the U.S. government, and this just happened very recently, in the laws that have been passed, and then sort of the statements that have been made by the current president around providing broadband connectivity to every single human in the United States. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. And I think our job here is to teach these and educate and sort of help drive change through systems like Helium. Does it make sense for large sort of traditional telco providers to trench fiber all the way across the world and all the way across the country, specifically for the US? If you have a remote city that doesn't have really good connectivity, is the best idea to like sort of dig a hole all the way through a forest or a desert to get there. And I would argue no. And this is like maybe back to your original point about like, eccentric billionaires putting satellites up. I think satellite connectivity is incredibly powerful. I think sort of having a hub and spoke model of, a couple of different landing sites in a certain city, and those landing sites being able to connect the rest of that city or the rest of that town, potentially to high-speed internet. I think that is a model that does work. And I think Helium can play a pretty crucial role there to make sure that the incentives are aligned to ultimately like to the people that are receiving coverage, and having that sort of local control and sort of a really good example of this. So I in my house, like we have a wireless antenna sort of back over there in that corner. Is part of a wireless ISP, and so I have a sort of 1 gigabit link that hits my house, and half of that is distributed across 30, 40 houses in my neighborhood. And this is without Helium, right? This is nothing. This is well before Helium, and that concept of being able to share internet in a way that allows all of us to have a very low cost, like kind of admin fee, roughly. Like I pay $30 a month for my internet, and so does every other like neighbor that connects to my node. And that's the kind of internet access that I think should happen. And I think it doesn't have to be the microwave antenna; it could be a satellite link as well instead. If I'm in a small town in the middle of a forest somewhere, as long as there isn't trees in the way, I guess.
Brilliant example. As you were talking about it, I was thinking about kind of the Wi-Fi extender or something like that. It's a similar model. We're just going to take as much optimal capacity as we have and try and make it stretch to the right places at the right cost point so that everyone's connected. And I think that's an appropriate mission. I think it's not an insignificant task. And again, thank you, Abhay, so much for being able to share with us your knowledge today. Shout to Helium. Shout to all the Helium node operators out there who are keeping the lights on, who are keeping Wi-Fi alive out there. We've come to time. There were other questions, but maybe we can try and get back to those in the LinkedIn comments by themselves. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe out there.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.